Darkstocking. Codex Tenebrae, Book 1, by Tom Klehm. Chapter 1. The Innocence. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the castle's jagged silhouette against the roiling clouds. Thunder followed, drowning out the woman's scream, but only for a moment. The Queen's wail pierced the night, a sound of agony that echoed through stone corridors. Inside the royal chamber, servants scurried about like frightened mice. The Queen lay spread on the bed, her nightgown soaked with sweat, her face contorted in pain. Her golden hair, usually so carefully arranged, splayed wildly across the pillows. "Push, Your Majesty." The elderly midwife hunched over the Queen's spread legs, her gnarled hands ready. Something in her eyes gleamed with anticipation beyond professional duty. "The child comes now." The king stood rigid at the chamber's edge, his knuckles white against his ceremonial sword hilt. "Is all well?" His voice cracked with worry. The Queen's scream reached a crescendo as she gave one final push. Then came a different sound, the midwife's sharp intake of breath. Silence fell. "The child," the midwife whispered, her voice hollow. "The child is stillborn." The Queen's face crumpled. "No! No!" Her scream transformed into something worse, the howl of a mother's grief. "Give me my baby." The king rushed forward, face ashen. "This cannot be." "Let me see." "Your Majesty." The midwife wrapped the tiny, motionless form in linens. The Queen should hold her child, at least once. She placed the bundle in the Queen's trembling arms. The royal couple bent over their lost heir, their sobs mingling in the storm-punctuated darkness. In the chaos of grief, no one noticed the midwife slipping away. Another bundle clutched to her chest. Her footsteps whispered against stone as she hurried down winding staircases, through abandoned corridors. Outside, the rain lashed her face, but she pressed on toward the stables. Inside, she barred the door and laid the bundle on a bed of straw. The infant's face was peaceful in death, skin like wax, with a distinctive mole marking her left cheek. The midwife's transformation was immediate. Gone was the servile posture, the deferential tone. She stood tall, eyes alight with purpose. From beneath her robes came strange implements, a dagger with symbols etched along its blade, vials of dark liquid, bones of small animals. She arranged them in a circle around the lifeless infant and began to chant. Words no human tongue was meant to form spilled from her lips as she sliced her palm, letting blood drip onto the baby's forehead. "Rise," she commanded. "Rise, my child." The storm outside intensified, lightning striking so close the stable timbers shook. The midwife's chanting grew louder, more frenzied, her body swaying in rhythm with forces unseen. The baby's eyes snapped open, glowing crimson in the darkness. A tiny gasp, then breath. But something was wrong. The infant's face twisted into an expression no newborn should possess: cunning, malevolence, hunger. The midwife cackled, the sound mingling with the thunder. The baby joined her, its laugh starting as a gurgle before deepening, becoming something ancient and diabolical. Its skin began to glow red from within, like embers. Then, with sickening cracks, two small protrusions formed on its forehead, growing into curved horns. "Perfect," the midwife whispered, reaching down to touch the mole on the baby's cheek. The fulfillment of, "Candace! Candace! Wake up!" Candace bolted upright, gasping for air. Her nightgown clung to her skin, soaked through with sweat. The familiar walls of her cottage came into focus, the nightmare's grip loosening. "Mother?" Her voice sounded small, childlike. Leda sat on the bed's edge, concern etched across her beautiful face. You were thrashing something terrible. Another bad dream? Candace nodded, unable to speak, as the nightmare's images still flickered behind her eyes. That castle, the Queen's screams, the baby with those horrible red eyes. It felt so real, she whispered. Dreams often do, my love. Leda brushed damp strands of golden blonde hair from Candace's forehead. But they're just dreams. As her mother leaned closer, the early morning light caught her face at an angle, highlighting the small mole on her left cheek. Candace froze. The same mole, exactly where it had been on the baby in her dream. "What is it?" Leda asked, noticing her daughter's stare. Candace swallowed hard. Nothing. Just the dream. There was a baby with a mole just like yours. Leda's hand drifted unconsciously to her cheek. Is that so? Well, I've had this mark since birth. Nothing mysterious about it. She smiled, but something flickered behind her eyes. Now up with you. The day waits for no one, not even girls with wild dreams. As her mother rose and moved to open the curtains, Candace took deep breaths. Just a dream, a coincidence, nothing more. Make sure to bathe Elfric today. He's still dirty from yesterday, Leda noted, her voice steady and regular, already moving on. Yes, Mother, Candace answered, the nightmare's grip finally releasing her. Sunlight spilled into the room, banishing the last shadows of her dream. Candace pushed back the covers, ready to rise and forget. Just a dream. Nothing more. Candace shook off the last remnants of her nightmare as she gathered her fishing gear. Her slender fingers worked methodically, checking lines and hooks while Elfric pranced around her feet, his excitement palpable in every bounce and wiggle of his copper-colored body. Patience, sweet boy, she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his silky ears. His tail whipped back and forth in response, a metronome of pure joy. She slipped her black cloak from its hook by the door, the fabric flowing like liquid shadow as she wrapped it around her shoulders. The weight of it was comforting, familiar. With practiced movements, she pulled the hood forward until it framed her face, obscuring her features from casual glances. Her mother shuffled to the wardrobe to undress, dark circles prominent beneath her eyes. Leda's normally graceful movements were sluggish, betraying the exhaustion of another long night pouring ale and entertaining men at the local tavern. "Wake me as soon as you return," Leda said, stifling a yawn. "We have a busy day today." Candace nodded, stepping forward to kiss her mother's cheek. "Sleep well." "Look at Elfric," Leda smiled tiredly, glancing down at Elfric, who sat at attention, his large brown eyes fixed adoringly on Candace. "He's so cute." Candace felt warmth bloom in her chest as she looked at her faithful companion. "He's my guardian." "And you are his," her mother replied, shuffling toward the bed. "Mind your back before midday. We need to tend the garden today." Candace and Elfric head out. The morning air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers and damp earth. Candace breathed deeply the crisp air, letting nature wash away the lingering unease of her dream. Elfric darted ahead, his red coat gleaming like burnished copper in the dappled sunlight that broke through the forest canopy. "Don't go too far," she called, though she knew he never would. Not her Elfric. The path to the stream was worn smooth by their daily journeys. Candace moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every root and stone, every dip and rise. Her black cloak whispered against the undergrowth, a stark contrast to the vibrant greens and golds of early summer. The stream came into view, sunlight dancing across its surface like scattered diamonds. Elfric had already reached the bank and was sniffing intently at something in the soft mud. "What have you found, curious one?" Candace knelt beside him, setting down her fishing basket. Elfric looked up at her, ears perked forward, then back to his discovery. A strange track pressed into the mud, too large for a fox, too small for a deer, with an odd pattern she'd never seen before. "Something new in our woods," she mused, running her fingers lightly over the impression. Elfric woofed softly, pressing his warm body against her side. The contact grounded her, as it always did. Whatever made the track, whatever strange dreams might plague her nights, she had this, her faithful friend, the peaceful stream, the rhythm of their days together. She unfolded her simple fishing line and baited the hook. Elfric settled beside her, his chin resting on his paws, alert yet relaxed. The water burbled over stones, birds called from the trees, and Candace felt the rightness of the moment settle into her bones. This was their world. Just the two of them in perfect harmony with the forest around them. Whatever lay beyond, whatever mysteries her dreams hinted at, this bond was real and true. The fish tugged at Candace's line, a silver flash beneath the water's surface. With skilled precision, she tugged, experiencing the gratifying heft of her prize as it emerged from the stream amid a spray of water. A plump trout thrashed at the end of her line, scales glinting in the morning light. "Look, Elfric, our first catch," she smiled, unhooking the fish and placing it in her woven basket. Elfric sniffed at the basket with interest before returning to his watchful position beside her. The forest was quiet, save for birdsong and the gentle babble of the stream. Candace gazed at the water, watching sunlight dance across its surface. Something stirred within her, a yearning, a curiosity. She glanced around. No one ever came to this part of the woods. This was her sanctuary, her private place. For years, her mother's warnings had echoed in her ears. "Keep yourself hidden, Candace. Your beauty is a curse, not a blessing." But here, with only Elfric and the forest as witness. Her fingers found the edge of her hood, hesitating for just a moment before pulling it back. The weight of her golden hair tumbled free, cascading down her shoulders in waves that caught the sunlight like spun gold. The sensation of the breeze against her scalp was foreign, exhilarating. "Is this what freedom feels like, Elfric?" she whispered. The spaniel tilted his head, watching her with curious eyes. Emboldened, Candace unfastened the clasp at her throat. The heavy black cloak slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist. Her white dress, simple but fine, glowed in the dappled sunlight, the neckline lower than anything she'd dare wear outside their cottage. The fabric clung to the curves of her body, the swell of her breasts visible above the modest cut. She leaned back on her elbows, sinking slightly into the cool, damp sand of the riverbank. Above her, the canopy of trees framed a perfect blue sky. Sunbeams broke through the leaves, warming her exposed skin in patches of gold. Her porcelain complexion, never touched by direct sunlight, seemed to glow with an inner luminescence. Candace closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. The scent of earth and water filled her lungs. The breeze picked up, whispering through the trees and caressing her skin like cool fingers. She shivered, feeling her nipples harden beneath the thin fabric of her dress, pressing against the material in a way that would have mortified her had anyone been present to see. For the first time in her life, she felt truly free. No hood, no cloak, no hiding. Just Candace, the sky, and the forest. A low growl shattered her peace. Candace's eyes flew open. Elfric stood rigid, his hackles raised, staring into the trees across the stream. His growl deepened, a warning rumble that made the hair on her arms stand on end. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, pushing herself upright. Movement caught her eye, a darkness shifting between the trees. Not the natural shadow of branches or leaves, but something else. Something that seemed to absorb the light around it, an irregular void. As she watched, frozen in terror, the smoky darkness began to solidify, taking form. Red eyes blazed from within the shadowy mass, two burning coals that fixed directly on her. A deep, rumbling sound emanated from the form, neither human nor animal, but something primordial and horrifying. "Elfric!" Candace gasped, scrambling to her feet. The creature moved, gliding between the trees with unnatural speed. Elfric's growl erupted into furious barking as he positioned himself between Candace and the approaching horror. Her heart pounding, Candace snatched up her basket and cloak, her fingers clumsy with fear. Her fishing pole lay forgotten as she turned and fled. Elfric raced beside her, still barking his defiance at whatever pursued them. The forest path, so familiar and comforting earlier, now seemed endless. Branches clawed at her hair and dress, roots threatened to trip her at every step. She dared a glance back, and immediately wished she hadn't. The shadow was following, moving with a haunting grace, those red eyes never wavering from her. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but terror drove her forward. The cottage came into view, a haven in her nightmare. She burst through the garden gate, Elfric at her heels, and flung herself at the door. Her trembling hands fumbled with the latch before finally wrenching it open. Once inside, she slammed the door shut, throwing the bolt with a decisive click. She backed away, pressing herself into the corner of the room, sliding down until she sat huddled on the floor. Elfric stood guard, his body tense, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared at the door. The sudden movement from the bed made Candace jump. Leda sat upright, her hair disheveled from sleep, eyes wide with alarm. "Candace, what's happening?" She threw off the covers, hurrying to her daughter's side. "Why are you—" Her words died as she took in Candace's appearance. The uncovered hair, the white dress exposed, the absence of her cloak. "Something followed me," Candace whispered, her voice breaking. "From the stream. A shadow with red eyes." Leda's face drained of color. She gripped Candace's shoulders, her fingers digging in painfully. "Did you remove your cloak? Did you expose yourself?" Candace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Her mother's warnings, repeated since childhood, echoed in her mind with clarity. "Never expose yourself. You don't understand. You attract danger, my little one. In the name of the gods, listen to your mother." "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't think. I just wanted to feel the sun just once." Leda paced the small cottage, her nightgown swishing around her ankles. She paused at the single window, peering through a gap in the curtains before drawing them tighter. "I've warned you since you were a child," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Your beauty isn't a blessing, Candace. It's a curse." Candace remained huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around Elfric's warm body. The spaniel had calmed somewhat, but still watched the door with suspicious eyes. The cottage, her entire world for 18 years, suddenly felt like a fragile shell against whatever lurked outside. "What was that thing, Mother?" she whispered. Leda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the hearth where a small fire still smoldered. Above it hung the mantle that held their few precious possessions, a chipped porcelain figurine, a small stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, and the ornate wooden box containing the family amulet. Candace had always been fascinated by that box. Intricately carved with symbols she couldn't decipher, it held an amulet her mother never explained, only saying it was an ancient family heirloom. Now, Leda's fingers hovered over it, trembling slightly before withdrawing. "Something that should never have seen you," Leda finally replied. The cottage, small as it was, had been Candace's sanctuary. A single room with 2 beds, separated by a worn screen, a table with mismatched chairs, shelves lined with her precious books, and the hearth that provided warmth and cooking fire. The roof leaked when it rained, and the floorboards creaked with every step, but it was home, the only one she'd ever known. "I don't understand," Candace said, rising shakily to her feet. "Why would it follow me? What does it want?" Leda turned, her face ghostly in the dim light. "It wants you, my sweet girl." Outside, beyond the garden where they grew vegetables and herbs, lay her father's grave. Thurston Blanchard, a name without a face in Candace's mind. Each week they would gather wildflowers to place on the well-tended mound, but her mother never spoke of him, changing the subject whenever Candace asked. Candace moved to the table where her books were stacked. Histories, romances, adventure tales, all brought by her mother from the village traders. These books had been her window to the world beyond their isolated cottage, beyond the forest, beyond even Sighthaven, with its reputation for harboring the kingdom's dregs. Such volumes represented a small fortune, typically found only in the libraries of nobles and the wealthy, certainly not in the possession of a poor family like theirs. Her mother made sacrifices to acquire the books so Candace would have a better future. Leda had also taught her the fundamentals of Anglican doctrine, even though they never went to church, which was required by law, a law never enforced in Sighthaven. "You've never let me go to the village," Candace said quietly. "Is that why? Because of things like that shadow?" "Sighthaven is no place for you," Leda said firmly. "It's a den of thieves and cutthroats, the armpit of the kingdom, the tavern where I work." She stopped, shaking her head. "I've done everything to keep you away from there." Candace knew the routine of their lives by heart. Every dawn, her mother would return from her night's work at the tavern, exhausted, but always taking time to wake Candace with a kiss on the forehead. Then Candace and Elfric would head to the stream to fish while her mother slept. Afternoons were for cooking and tending the garden together, singing old folk songs as they worked. Evenings, Candace would help her mother prepare for work, brushing her beautiful blonde hair, so like her own, before Leda left for the village. Nights were for reading by candlelight, Elfric curled at her feet until sleep claimed her. This pattern had shaped her entire existence. "You've kept me hidden away like some secret treasure," Candace said, a hint of accusation in her voice. "Because you are a treasure," Leda replied, crossing to take Candace's hands in hers. "My most precious one. When you were born—" She stopped again, something like fear crossing her face. "Your beauty isn't ordinary, Candace. It never has been." "But I've been careful," Candace protested. "I always wear the cloak and hood when we go to gather herbs or when fishing. Today was the first time I've ever—" "And look what happened!" Leda's voice rose. Candace flinched at her mother's tone. Leda rarely raised her voice. "I'm sorry," Leda said, softer now. "I'm not angry with you. I only want the best for you." She cupped Candace's face in her hands. "Everything I've done, keeping you here, teaching you to read in both English and Latin, to fish, to garden, to make yourself invisible when strangers are near. It's all been to protect you. One day you will understand." The next morning, Candace rose early, determined to put yesterday's encounter behind her. The fish practically leapt onto her hook, filling her basket faster than usual. By mid-morning, she had caught enough for several meals. "Let's head back, Elfric. Mother will be pleased with our haul." The cottage was quiet when they returned, her mother's soft snores audible from behind the screen. Candace placed the fish in a clay pot of salt water and wiped her hands on her apron. With hours before, her mother would wake, restlessness tugged at her. "Let's go, Elfric." She grabbed the stuffed leather ball from the shelf Elfric loved to play with and tossed it in the air. The spaniel's eyes followed its arc, his tail wagging furiously. "Want to play?" Outside, she threw the ball into the woods. Elfric bolted after it, his golden coat flashing between trees. Moments later, he returned, ball clamped proudly in his jaws, tail whipping back and forth. "Good boy," Candace laughed, taking the slobbery ball and throwing it again. They played for nearly an hour, Elfric never tiring of the game. Each time he returned, he dropped the ball at her feet with a proud bark, ready for the next throw. Candace's earlier fears dissolved in the simple joy of play. "Come on, boy," she called, adjusting her hood. "Let's run." They raced through the forest, weaving between ancient trees, leaping over fallen logs. Candace felt free, her cloak billowing behind her, Elfric matching her pace. Sunlight dappled the forest floor through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow. Eventually, breathless and laughing, they reached their favorite spot, a cliff edge overlooking Sighthaven Harbor. Candace settled on a flat rock, Elfric flopping beside her, panting happily. Below, the village sprawled along the coastline, ships bobbing in the harbor like toys in a bath. From this distance, Sighthaven looked almost beautiful. The sun glinted off the water, fishing boats drifted in and out of the harbor, and tiny figures moved about the docks. Candace rested her chin on her knees, watching a merchant ship unfurl its sails. "Where do you think that one's from, Elfric?" she whispered. "Maybe the Northern Isles? Or the Eastern Empire?" She'd read about these places in her books, imagining exotic spices and colorful silks, languages she couldn't understand, and foods she'd never tasted. The ships represented everything beyond her reach: adventure, discovery, a world larger than her small existence. The sun climbed higher. Candace sighed, knowing her mother would be waking soon. "Time to go, boy. Race me home." They sprinted back through the forest, Candace's laughter mingling with Elfric's excited barks. When they burst from the tree line, Leda stood in the doorway of their cottage, smiling. Candace ran to her, throwing herself into her mother's arms. "Good morning," Leda said, hugging her tightly. "I caught plenty of fish," Candace replied, breathless from running. Inside, Elfric collapsed onto his rug by the hearth, utterly spent. Candace gathered scraps from yesterday's fish, placing them in his wooden bowl. "Here, boy," she said, setting the bowl beside him. But Elfric was already fast asleep, too tired even for food. Candace smiled, watching his sides rise and fall in deep sleep. She joined her mother at the table, helping to prepare their meal, chopping herbs from their garden, while Leda gutted and filleted the fresh fish. "I learned a new song last night," Leda said suddenly. "Want to hear it?" "I'd love that, Mother." Leda wiped her hands on her apron and began to sing. Her voice filled their small home, clear and sweet as a mountain stream. She twirled around the kitchen, her movements graceful despite her fatigue, the melody rising and falling like waves on the shore. Candace watched, entranced. In these moments her mother seemed transformed, younger, lighter, free from whatever burdens she carried. As the final note faded, Candace sighed contentedly. That was beautiful. As her mother finished the song, Candace noticed something she'd overlooked in the dim morning light. Purplish marks bloomed across Leda's cheekbone, disappearing beneath her hairline. A faint yellow-green bruise ringed her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up. "The wolves again, Mother?" Candace asked quietly. Leda's hand flew to her cheek. She turned away, busying herself with the fish. Yes, it was the wolves. The words hung in the air, hollow and unconvincing. Candace had heard this explanation countless times over the years. Wolves at the tavern. Wolves on the path home. Wolves that somehow never left tooth marks, only bruises shaped suspiciously like handprints. "I see you come home frequently with bruises," Candace said, keeping her voice gentle but firm. "And you always blame it on wolves. I'm not stupid, Mother. Tell me the truth." Leda's hands stilled over the fish, her shoulders tensed, then slumped in defeat. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, staring out at the garden and the forest beyond. The morning light caught the silver strands in her golden hair, making them glitter like threads in a tapestry. "You're right," she said finally. "You're not a child anymore. I think it's time I told you the whole truth." She motioned for Candace to sit down at the table. Candace obeyed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Whatever she'd expected, the gravity in her mother's voice suggested something far worse than she'd imagined. Leda sat across from her, hands folded on the worn wooden surface. "Your father is not dead," she said, the words falling like stones. "And his name is not Thurston." The room seemed to tilt. Candace gripped the edge of the table. "How can this be true?" "It is true." Leda's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "As you know, I am a barmaid. But I'm also a tavern whore." The last word crashed between them. Leda's composure shattered, tears streaming down her face, shoulders shaking with sobs she'd held back for years. "It's the only way I know how to give you a better life." Candace sat frozen, unable to process what she'd heard. The mother she knew, who sang sweet songs, who taught her to read, who brushed her hair each night before bed, this woman who had been her entire world, suddenly transformed into someone she barely recognized. Leda stood abruptly and crossed to the far wall. She knelt and pried loose a floorboard Candace had never noticed was different from the others. From the small cavity beneath, she pulled out a leather pouch that clinked softly as she set it on the table. "Look here," she said, loosening the drawstring. Coins spilled out. Copper, silver, and even gold pieces. More money than Candace had ever seen in one place. "This is money I have been saving. It will soon be enough to help us move away from here and start a better life in a new place." Candace stared at the small fortune. Each coin represented a piece of her mother sold, a night of humiliation, a bruise explained away as a wolf attack. She felt sick. "Oh, Mother." Candace rose and went to Leda, wrapping her arms around her. They clung to each other, two women adrift in a world that had shown them little kindness. "I love you, Mother." "I love you too, Candace," Leda whispered into her hair. "Everything will be all right. I promise." Candace's tears came then, hot and bitter. She cried for the childhood illusion now shattered, for her mother's sacrifices, for the grave in the garden that held no one. They stood locked together, their shared grief binding them tighter than blood. When the storm of emotion subsided, Candace pulled back, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. A question burned in her mind. "Then who is my father?" Leda stiffened. She turned away again, returning the coin pouch to its hidden compartment, then looking out the window at the forest that had both protected and imprisoned them. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Elfric stirred in his sleep, paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits. A log shifted in the hearth, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, a bird called to its mate. Still, Leda did not reply. Candace waited, watching her mother's profile against the window light. The mole on her cheek, the same mark Candace had seen in her nightmare, seemed darker now, more pronounced. Something about that mark nagged at her memory. Something important she couldn't quite grasp. The cottage felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. The books that had been her escape now seemed like poor substitutes for the world they described. Candace's mind raced with new questions. If her father wasn't Thurston, who was buried in the garden? Why had her mother created such an elaborate lie? And most importantly, what did all this have to do with the shadow creature that had pursued her at the stream? The silence stretched on, broken only by Elfric's soft snores and the distant call of birds. Whatever truth lay behind her mother's silence, Candace sensed it was darker and more dangerous than anything she had imagined. Suddenly, a violent pounding at the door shattered their world. "Open the door, songbird whore! I hear you in there!" A man's voice, rough as gravel, sliced through the quiet cottage. Candace's heart leapt into her throat. Her mother's eyes went wide, a look of pure terror contorting her face. "Candace," she hissed, "hide under the bed. Now!" Candace scrambled to obey, her body moving on instinct. She slid beneath the bed, the wooden slats pressing against her back, her eyes fixated on the doorway leading into the cottage. Leda moved with a desperation born of fear. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the block on the counter, its blade gleaming in the morning light, and tucked herself into the corner. The pounding came again, the door shuddering under the force of a boot. The wood around the latch splintered, a harbinger of the destruction to come. Candace bit down on her knuckle to stifle a whimper, her breath coming in shallow gasps. With a final thunderous kick, the door burst open, hinges shrieking in protest. Two tall, rugged men filled the doorway, their presence malevolent and suffocating. They stepped into the cottage, eyes adjusting to the dim light, their grins cruel and predatory. The stench of unwashed bodies and stale ale filled the small space. "I think we have caged the bird," the man bellowed, his voice a sick celebration of their intrusion. He was massive, a wall of muscle and menace. Half his face was a mass of puckered, shiny tissue, a burn scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The second man, smaller but no less threatening, closed the door behind them, his laughter echoing off the walls. The scarred man lunged toward Leda, his movements swift and brutal. Leda's arm shot out, the knife glinting as she slashed at the air. But he was too fast, too strong. He caught her wrist in his meaty hand, squeezing until the knife clattered to the floor. Candace watched, paralyzed with fear, as he dragged her mother to the center of the room. Leda's back hit the table with a thud, her breath escaping in a gasp. The man's hand closed around her throat as she struggled to breathe. The second man, his face a mask of depraved delight, moved to Leda's other side. Leda's face turned a sickly shade of red as she choked. The scarred man leaned in close to Leda, his voice a low growl. "Your little song made my cock hard." With his free hand, he tore open her shirt with a savage jerk, the sound of ripping fabric mingling with Leda's struggle to breathe. Her breasts spilled forth, exposed to their lecherous gazes in the dim, flickering light of the cottage. He fondled her roughly, his calloused fingers digging cruelly into her soft flesh. leaving angry red marks that bloomed like roses on her porcelain skin. Leda's eyes squeezed shut in humiliation as he kneaded and pinched, his hot breath reeking of ale washing over her face. The scarred man chuckled darkly as his companion watched with undisguised hunger, licking his lips in anticipation of his turn. Candace's heart hammered against her ribs beneath the bed as she witnessed her beautiful mother reduced to an object for these monsters' pleasure. "I've been waiting to fuck your cunt for many days, woman," he sneered, his hand moving down to her skirts. Leda's eyes found Candace's beneath the bed, a silent plea for forgiveness. Candace could only watch in mute horror as the man spread her mother's legs apart. The scarred man fumbled with his breeches, releasing his engorged member with a grunt of satisfaction. He positioned himself between Leda's thighs, his intention clear and vile. He thrust into her with a savagery that made Candace's stomach churn. Leda's moans pierced the air, a soundtrack to the brutal assault taking place just inches from Candace's hiding spot. Her mother's voice, once melodious when singing lullabies at bedtime, now moaned with each violent thrust. Candace pressed her trembling fingers against her lips to keep from crying out, tasting the salt of silent tears that streamed down her cheeks. The man said, "You want this cock, don't you, bitch?" Leda nodded, eyes rolling back in her head, while he choked her, thrusting into her harder. Candace pressed her face into the wood floor beneath the bed, trying to block out the sounds, but they pierced through her skull like daggers. Her mother's moans, the man's vile words, the rhythmic thudding of the table legs against the floor, they all burned into her memory. Candace's fingernails dug into the floorboards until they bled. She wanted to scream, to rush out and stab the men with her mother's dropped knife, but terror froze her limbs, made her lungs seize up. The scarred man's pace quickened, his massive hands squeezing her mother's throat tighter as she struggled for air. Candace bit down on her sleeve to muffle her sobs. This couldn't be happening. Her mother, her beautiful, singing mother, who told her stories and brushed her hair, reduced to this. A toy. A thing. The man's hips pistoned relentlessly, driving forward with savage rhythm that shook the wooden frame of the table. His grunts of pleasure mingled with the sound of flesh slapping flesh, creating a horrific symphony that would forever haunt Candace's nightmares. The floorboards beneath them creaked in protest with each brutal movement, as if the very cottage itself objected to the depravity occurring within its walls. He flipped Leda around, bending her over as the second man approached, his manhood in hand. Candace watched as her mother's body was used in the most depraved of ways. The scarred man continued his thrusting from behind, his fingers bruising as they dug into her hips. Each savage thrust elicited a moan from Leda, her body jerking forward with the force of his hips. Sweat gleamed on his brow as he maintained his merciless rhythm, his face contorted with a mixture of lust and contempt that transformed his already frightening visage into something truly monstrous. The second man, thrusting his manhood into her mouth, groaned with carnal pleasure, his calloused fingers tangling in Leda's disheveled hair as he gripped her skull with both hands. His breath came in ragged gasps, growing more frantic with each forceful movement. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping onto Leda's face beneath him. Choking sounds emanated from her throat as she gagged on his manhood. "That's it!" he growled through clenched teeth, his voice thick with depravity. "Take it all." His body tensed suddenly, muscles cording in his neck as he finally reached his climax, shooting his semen down Leda's throat with several jerks of his hips. Spittle and semen dribbled from the corners of her mouth and ran down her chin. Candace's entire body trembled as she watched the nightmare unfold. Every sound, The table leg scraping against the floor, her mother's muffled moaning, the men's grotesque grunts, etched itself permanently into her memory. "Swallow it, bitch!" the second man commanded, still holding Leda's head firmly in place as she nods. "Every last drop." The sight of her mother's submission shattered something fundamental inside Candace. This wasn't just a violation, it was humiliation. Finally, the scarred man reached his climax, his body shuddering as waves of pleasure coursed through him. His face contorted into a profane grin, revealing yellowed teeth between cracked lips as he threw his head back in ecstasy. Sweat glistened on his brow and neck, catching the dim light as it trickled down his weathered skin. He withdrew from Leda, his semen oozing out of her body. Wiping himself carelessly on the edge of her nightgown, he tucked his spent manhood back into his breeches with a satisfied grunt that rumbled deep in his chest. But the ordeal was far from over. The scarred man spotted the amulet on the mantel, its gemstone catching the light in a sinister dance. "Look what we have here," he said, his voice dripping with greed as he pushed Leda away. Leda's eyes widened, a wave of terror washing over her. "Please, no," she begged, her voice hoarse as she grabbed the man by the arm. The scarred man grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. Leda fought, her hands clawing, but it was futile. With his other hand, the man drew a dagger from his waist. Candace saw the glint of the blade, saw the look of triumph in the man's eyes. "Shut up, stupid whore!" he spat in her face. Candace saw it all in horrifying clarity. The blade plunging deep, the sound of metal piercing flesh, her mother's body jerking upward as the man lifted her by the dagger buried in her chest. Blood bloomed across Leda's nightgown, spreading like spilled wine. The man held her suspended for a moment, his face inches from hers, before dropping her to the floor like discarded rubbish. He yanked the dagger free with a wet, sucking sound that would haunt Candace's nightmares. Her mother fell face up, her body crumpling unnaturally. From under the bed, Candace could see her mother's face, those familiar features now slack with shock, blue eyes wide and staring. Those eyes found Candace's in the darkness under the bed, locking with her daughter's gaze. Tears slid down Leda's cheeks as blood pumped from the wound in her chest, pooling on the floor beneath her. The scarred man pocketed the amulet. "Let's go before anyone comes." He wiped his blade on Leda's nightgown. "Not that anyone would come to help a whore," he sneered. They left as quickly as they had entered, boots stomping across the wooden floor, the broken door swinging uselessly in their wake. Candace remained frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Her mother's eyes remained fixed on hers, still aware, still loving, even as the light in them began to dim. Blood spread across the floor in a widening circle, eventually reaching the edge of the bed where Candace lay. The warm wetness touched her fingers where they pressed against the floor. Her mother's blood. Candace wanted to scream, to rush to her mother's side, but terror kept her paralyzed. Leda's lips moved, trying to form words. No sound came, only a bubble of blood that burst at the corner of her mouth. Her chest rose once more, a shallow, rattling breath, and then stilled forever. The cottage fell silent. Candace remained under the bed, her body rigid with shock. Her mind refused to process what her eyes had witnessed. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Any moment, she would wake from this nightmare. But the hours crept by, marked by the sun's passage across the floor. The blood around her mother's body congealed, darkening from bright red to deep maroon. Flies began to gather, drawn by the coppery scent. Still, Candace couldn't move. Her limbs felt leaden, her throat closed tight against the scream building inside her. Tears flowed unchecked down her face, soaking the dusty floor beneath her cheek. As daylight faded, exhaustion finally overcame her. Candace's swollen eyes drifted closed, her consciousness retreating from the horror that had shattered her world. She slipped into a fitful sleep, still curled beneath the bed. Her mother's lifeless eyes, the last image, burned into her mind. The first light of dawn filtered through the broken door, painting harsh stripes across the floor. Candace's eyes fluttered open, her body stiff and aching from hours curled beneath the bed. For one blissful moment, her mind was blank. Then reality crashed down upon her. A high-pitched whine cut through the silence. Elfric sat beside Leda's body, his head tilted back as he released a mournful cry that seemed to echo Candace's own grief. The little spaniel nudged at Leda's cold hand with his nose, then looked toward the bed, as if pleading for Candace to fix what had happened. "Elfric," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse and tears. The dog padded over, his paws tracking through the dried blood. He licked her face as she crawled from beneath the bed, his warm tongue washing away her tears, even as fresh ones formed. Candace forced herself to look at her mother. Leda lay exactly as she had fallen, her nightgown stiff with blood, her beautiful face now waxy and pale. Those blue eyes, so like Candace's own, stared sightlessly at the ceiling, no longer holding the warmth and love that had defined them in life. "I can't leave you here," Candace murmured, kneeling beside her mother's body. "Not like this." With trembling hands, she closed Leda's eyes, her fingertips lingering on the cold skin. The mole on her mother's cheek, the same one from her nightmare, seemed to mock her now, a reminder of mysteries that would remain forever unsolved. Gathering her strength, Candace slipped her arms beneath her mother's shoulders and knees. Leda had always seemed so strong, so capable, but in death she felt small and fragile. Candace staggered under the weight, but determination fueled her steps as she carried her mother out of the cottage. The forest path to the stream was dappled with morning light. Birds sang overhead, oblivious to the tragedy below. Elfric trotted alongside, occasionally looking up at Leda's dangling hand as if expecting it to reach down and scratch his ears. At the stream, the same place where she'd encountered the shadow creature, Candace laid her mother gently on the soft earth. The water babbled cheerfully, at odds with the grim task before her. "This was always your favorite place," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Leda's face. "You said the water soothed your soul." Working methodically through her tears, Candace gathered rocks from the streambed. The largest ones required all her strength to lift, her muscles screaming in protest as she placed them one by one over her mother's body. Water dripped from the stones onto Leda's pale face, like the tears Candace could no longer shed. When the makeshift cairn was complete, Candace gathered wildflowers from along the bank, pale yellow primrose, white daisies, and the small blue forget-me-nots that Leda had always loved. She arranged them atop the stones, a splash of color against the grey. "I don't know the proper words," she admitted to the silent forest. "You never taught me prayers for the dead." Instead, she hummed the lullaby Leda had sung to her as a child, her voice breaking on the high notes. When she finished, she pressed her palm against the topmost stone. "Goodbye, Mother," she whispered. "I'll carry your love with me, always and forever." The walk back to the cottage seemed longer, her feet dragging with exhaustion and grief. Inside, the evidence of violence remained: upturned furniture, broken crockery, the dark stain on the floor. Candace stepped around it, moving with sudden purpose. She knew precisely where Leda kept their savings. Under the floorboard, in a hidden compartment, lay the small pouch of coins, payment from the tavern, and men Candace tried not to think about. She wondered if the pouch held enough value for a fresh start somewhere new. Candace grabbed her worn leather satchel from its hook by the door. Into it went the coin purse, a change of clothes, a small knife, the last of their bread, and the tiny wooden horse her mother had carved for her 10th birthday. Her fingers brushed something soft at the bottom of the bag, the doll she'd outgrown years ago, but couldn't bear to part with. "You too, little one," she whispered, tucking it safely among her belongings. She changed out of her blood-stained dress into her plainest one, then pulled on her black cloak. The familiar weight settled on her shoulders like armor. She wrapped a scarf around her golden hair, tucking every strand carefully out of sight. Candace stood in the center of the cottage, turning slowly to commit every detail to memory. The rocking chair where Leda had told stories on winter evenings, the table where they'd shared simple meals and complicated conversations. "Come, Elfric," she called, her voice steadier now. The spaniel trotted to her side, pressing against her leg as if sensing her need for comfort. Candace bent to scratch behind his ears. "It's just us now," she told him softly. "We have to be brave." With one last look at the only home she'd ever known, Candace stepped through the broken door into the morning light. She didn't bother to close it behind her. There was nothing left to protect. The forest path wound through ancient trees, their leaves casting shifting patterns of light and shadow. Elfric darted ahead, then back to her side, his presence a small comfort in the vastness of her grief. Candace had rarely ventured beyond their isolated cottage. Sighthaven had been a distant place of mystery where her mother worked, but she was forbidden to follow. Now it represented her only hope. With each step, grief hardened into resolve within her chest. The forest began to thin as she approached the outskirts of town. Ahead, she could see the first buildings of Sighthaven, and beyond them, the glitter of the harbour where ships came and went, carrying people to distant shores. Somewhere out there were the answers that would heal her heart, and Candace Blanchard would find them, no matter how long it took. Thank you for listening to Darkstocking by Tom Klehm. Paperback and ebook versions are available at Amazon. Links are in the description below.